Yeah, and it's going to be on my personal instead of on my show page, unfortunately. But
Okay.
hi, guys. This is going to be a fun interview. Please stick around. I'm interviewing Associate Professor. We said, yeah, Associate Professor Dr. Joshua Swamidass from Washington University. So stay tuned. For this one, let's do one. Let's do the 26 minutes straight through because, yeah, I do not want to cut off a single minute of conversation with him. I absolutely love it. Okay. Yeah. It ends up feeling very superficial whenever I have to cut off in the middle. Okay. All right. You felt that too? Okay. All right. Thanks, Ellie. Totally get that. We're on the same wavelength. I love you, Ellie. Right. And I've certainly had guests like that, where it's like, we really need that break to reconvene. Maybe they're more nervous or things like that. So, yeah, but this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm really excited. Yeah. All right, sounds good. Yeah. So I won't be able to see the questions effectively from over there, so you'll kind of let me know if you get some good ones?
Yeah, let's see. I should be able to ask here, yeah.
Great.
Feel free to ask us.
Yeah, and if there are some that we don't get to on air, we can take a minute or two after, I guess, and just answer on Facebook Live. Oh, right. There is that. Thanks, Ellie. Yeah.
Well, I won't in general do it. I just let people know so they know now that we can take questions if they want to. We'll see if they do. Maybe not. Maybe they will. Who knows?
Sounds good. Thank you. Awesome. This is Amanda LaPlante, and you're listening to Get Real to Heal on KWRHLP 92.9 FM. With me today is Associate Professor of Laboratory and Genomic Medicine at Washington University, Dr. Joshua Swamidass. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Amanda. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk with you. I love our conversations, and I can't wait to bring them to everyone. So, all right. You have got an amazing blog. I want to touch on this first, called Peaceful Science. Share a little bit about your mission with that blog.
Yeah, so Peaceful Science started as a blog. It's growing into something more. We just got some funding from the John Templeton Foundation.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks. It was exciting and definitely not what I expected when all of this started a couple of years ago. But we're really trying to find some new ways forward in society to talk about complex and controversial questions that arise in science. One of the things I've been spending a lot of time engaging with different communities on is how to think about human origins in a way that builds bridges instead of just creating a big fight, which sometimes happens.
Yeah, say a little more about that for anyone that might not be tracking with us.
Yeah, so obviously there's certain communities that believe humans arose in a certain way, and the scientific community believes that it arose in another way. And I'm a scientist, and I'm also part of some of those communities too. I'm a Christian. And so how do you think about questions about human origins? Do we have a common ancestry with the great apes, or were we created by God, or was it some combination of the two? I think there's ways to think about that where we can not necessarily be in conflict, even though we might disagree on the most important of things.
Yeah, and so for the purpose of today's show, and we've talked about this, I can't wait to dive in and pick your brain on some other incarnation of some show that I will have in the future about all of these topics. But sticking with the kind of health theme, you're also, as we said, Associate Professor of Laboratory and Genomic Medicine at Washington University. And for people that may not know what in the world that means, what does that mean?
Yeah, so Laboratory and Genomic Medicine, it's a subfield of pathology.
Yeah.
We're the people at the hospital that run the laboratory testing. So whenever you send out your blood to get tested, or if you ever donate blood, or a urine sample, all those sorts of things, when there's a test done to figure out what's going on in some sample, that's run by laboratory medicine. And the genomic piece is that more recently there's been a lot more interest in looking at genetic testing and what's going on in our genomes to see how that could guide medicine, which gets to, I think, the topic that you wanted to discuss today of how do you actually personalize healthcare to individual people. And one of the ways we think about personalizing healthcare is by looking at genetic data too.
Yeah, and so I have so many questions along this line, and it's hard to know where to start. But so there is such an advantage, though, right, in terms of being able to really treat people effectively and just knowing what's present in that DNA, what's present in those genetics, right?
It's something that's being worked out right now. So we're figuring it out. It turns out that actually humans are really, really similar genetically. But at the same time, we really respond differently at times to different treatments. So we're still untangling why that is. Some of that is genetic, and we know that. It turns out that not nearly as much of it is genetic as you might guess.
Really?
Yeah. And so there's all these certain factors that we care about. So genetics is just one piece. Also, your age turns out to be really important too. So a lot of my work, we look at how different people respond to medicines differently, and one of the really big determinants is how old you are, whether or not you're 2 years old, 5 years old, 10 years old. Children are maturing, and they're different sorts of people at different ages.
So, and I think you had said this during a previous conversation. You said, a lot of people think of children as just miniature adults.
Yeah, so if...
And that's not.
So I'm a scientist, I'm a PhD, but I also have a medical degree, so I went to medical school, and it's a truism, it's something that they tell everyone when you go through your pediatric rotation, is that children are not just little adults. They're not just people, like adults scaled down. Well, they are people.
Sure. but yeah, so they're not just little shrunken adults, right? There's a lot that's different, right? And so I think you told me a little bit about how they metabolize is different, things like that. So can you share a little more about that?
Yeah, so in my research, I really care about how drugs are metabolized differently or processed by our body differently. This is important because in one patient, you can give them a drug and it gets metabolized or broken down at a particular rate into a really safe metabolite or like end product. And then in another patient, maybe it gets broken down into a different product, and that product is actually, or that metabolite is toxic, and it ends up causing a lot of harm.
Right.
So what makes this patient different from that patient? Well, it turns out one of those differences could be their age. So when you look at children, it's not just that they have a different sized liver, which is where a lot of this processing happens. It's also that they have different proteins processing the drugs.
Okay.
In different amounts, and so when they take a drug, it might get processed into a different metabolite than it does for an adult, and that could make it actually unsafe for them.
Okay, so the work that you're doing will affect this how?
Well, so the...
I know that's a very broad question.
Yeah, so the question... So I told you hypothetically what could happen, right?
Yeah.
The real challenge when it comes to treating a patient is to know what's going to happen in their particular case. I mean, taking into account all the factors involved for that patient, what's actually going to happen. And so we have to really understand quite a bit of what's going on, not generally speaking across an entire population, but for that particular patient, how it's interacting. So their risk might be very different.
So how are some of the ways that you foresee that happening and playing out in medicine in the future?
Well, what's going on right now, it's not just our group. It's really a grand problem facing really the entire field. There's thousands of medical researchers that are thinking about this question. When you start taking into account all these factors, a person's genetics, a person's treatment history, all the other sorts of things that we can figure out or get to know about them, what's the best way to treat them? That's what it means to personalize care. Now, genetics is part of it, but it's not the whole story. We want to know, given the whole picture of this patient, not only what's going to work best for the average patient, but what's going to work best, what should we be doing different for that patient to really help them.
So it sounds really complex.
Yeah,
and there's a lot of people that need to be talking to one another. So I've told you a little bit about my backstory and kind of how I came to be sitting here doing what I do now, and my intense curiosity for trying to help people get well and understand how to navigate this system, right? There was a point where I had six specialists and a primary care physician I was seeing every month, and I was on. I had 18 active prescriptions at that time.
Wow.
Right, and my liver enzymes were off the charts, and everything was just not going well. So I'm really interested in this kind of thing because of my personal history, right? But I remember one of the difficulties was the specialists being able to talk to one another and communicate about that, and the overwhelm that my primary care experienced in trying to help me through that. How can that be better or different, and what do you foresee there?
Well, so what you're describing is a classic example of how people fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
If you had 18 prescriptions,
Yeah.
that is probably too many prescriptions.
Yeah, a little bit.
And so, to give you a sense of where the problem lies, is when a new drug comes to market, people spend a lot of time figuring out how individual drugs are interacting with other drugs and what's going on the average case. But when a person has 18 drugs, is there an interaction between them? We're starting to get into a place where those 18 drugs that you were given is going to be a fairly unique set of 18 drugs.
Right.
You might have been the only person in the entire country that was given that set of 18 drugs at the same time.
Yeah. My pharmacist, quite frankly, didn't know what to do with me either. Just kind of like, oh, okay.
And so we need to be able to understand, basically, in this situation, several things. First of all, how many of those drugs really did you need to be on?
Right.
Maybe not all of them. And also, part of what's going on, too, is the way how it works in medicine is that you don't want to mess with someone's prescriptions if it's there. If you're not the one who prescribed the drug, you don't know the whole story of why that was there, you don't want to take them off the drug. So there ends up being these zombie prescriptions.
Wow, yeah.
So you went to one specialist, they prescribed a drug, then you went to talk to another person.
Right, because they're like, well, I don't deal with this system, and I had 7 different autoimmune diseases that had been classified that I was dealing with. So they're like, well, we're going to send you here, and we're going to send you here, and everybody was doing the best that they could.
And then, you get this problem where people kind of like, well, if I touch it and it breaks, then it's my problem, so I don't want to touch that prescription. And so it starts accumulating. And that's a big problem because you really needed probably some doctors to be there to sit down and say, I'm going to deal with the whole picture and figure out not just what I should prescribe, but what I should de-prescribe.
Well, and so that's actually where I ended up stepping away from the allopathic model and stepping into the functional medicine model and the integrative model, working with an MD who had then stepped back and gone on for training in functional medicine and trying to figure out, okay, what do you really need to be on, and are there some nutritional things that we can do to make things different, and also looked at, like I had the MTHFR mutation, and I know there's a lot of controversy around that too, I'm sure. But by going on a high dose of methylated B vitamin, which I know also has potential side effects that may not be good, I was able to get off of a lot of those medications just by making that change, and it had to do with my DNA. And I would let you talk more about that because that's a little above my pay grade to get into that topic too far. But it was miraculous, the difference that made in my health.
Yeah, well, if you got to the point of having 18 prescriptions, something went wrong.
A lot of things went very wrong, yes.
Yeah, so, that seems like that really makes sense that would have been a good direction to go, to actually have someone who's sitting down and not thinking about an individual piece of the puzzle and not trying to compartmentalize what's happened before off from this, but to really sit down and think about the whole picture of what's going to make sense. And, medicine doesn't always do a good job at that. As it's typically, or sometimes practiced, I should say. I think what we're really hoping to see is a shift where there's a better approach to primary care, where certainly there's going to be specialists too. But we're going to be thinking about that bigger picture, because in the end, we don't want patients to be super complex, because there's too many interacting parts at that point where it starts getting beyond what we know from doing clinical studies, where it gets to the point where there could actually be a real severe reaction or interaction that happens.
Yeah.
And the best thing is if we're on the least amount of medications, but the ones that we are on, we really, really should be on, because we know it'll actually have an impact and it'll help.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and what I do now, what I love about what I'm doing as a health coach is just helping people to understand that they can have an impact on their health in terms of making sure that they're doing some preventive things in the first place, like managing their stress effectively, eating right, Exercising, exactly. Just taking care of themselves and
Yeah.
taking that responsibility back, because I think as a society we've gotten used to being able to pop a pill and put it off on someone else to fix us.
Yeah, well, it's tricky. So I think there's a balance here. So I think the part that I really agree with is that you can't really outsource your health.
Yeah, it starts at home.
I mean, we have to take responsibility for it. We're the only ones that are going to be there at every single doctor appointment.
Right? You are the expert on your own body to an extent, right?
Well, you're certainly one who's going to be continuously there through the whole thing, right?
Yeah.
And you know, a doctor is always going to be a person who's coming in with specific expertise that's going to see part of the picture.
Yeah.
And because of that, you know, they're just not going to see everything that we're going to see as a patient. And I say that as a doctor too, because I'm a doctor and a patient, right?
Right.
Or a physician and a patient. But at the same token, you know, there's things where, you know, we can actually get medical knowledge that is usually going to be helpful.
Yeah.
And so it really comes down to this place of being able to figure out, you know, how we can take responsibility for our own healthcare, but also still get good advice.
I think that's a good point and very important. You know, and I always touch back on, you know, a lot of the things that I've been able to put into remission have been through dietary, stress management, things like that. Yes, that's all effective. But I also had rheumatic fever with Sydenham's chorea. I wouldn't be sitting here without penicillin and some other interventions that I had. I am so thankful for modern medicine.
Yeah.
So thankful for modern medicine. Wouldn't be here. So it's, you know, like you said, finding that balance, right, to get that good advice, but also take responsibility for your own health. So moving on, though, so I got so many things I want to pick your brain on.
Sure.
All right, we had a little bit of a conversation about, where to start. Let's throw out the word epigenetics, right? Because, as you had said, it's kind of an overused or abused term. Can you clarify it?
So genetics usually pertains to things that are in our DNA. It's a sequence of 4 bases, which we represent with ACGT, and we have a genome which has all these strung together. So epigenetics is a catch-all term for meaning things that are inherited outside of that sequence of letters. And it's a really broad term that means a really large number of things. So sometimes in the literature it means that actually you can have little modified versions of those little 4 letters. We call it, for example, methylation or acetylation of histones. There's all these complex biological things going on structurally really closely associated with DNA, but it can also range all the way up to talking about things like culture. So for example, I speak English. That means that, you know, I have a 4-month-old at home, and I have a 3-year-old at home. Now, just from the fact that I speak English, you can probably make a pretty good guess that my children are speaking English too.
Fair enough. Yeah.
In a way, and you'd be right. Well, I mean, I guess the 4 week isn't.
You're not quite yet.
Yeah, but eventually he'll be speaking English. And in that sense, the language we speak is inherited from our parents.
Yeah.
And so, and it's a real sort of inheritance. It's not made up. It's actually very highly predictive. If we talk to a family that speaks Spanish, they're probably passing on speaking Spanish to their children and so on and so forth. And so it does make sense to talk about that as an inheritance, but it's also not in our DNA. So it turns out that, you know, if you just go back a few generations, my family was not speaking English. They were speaking things like Tamil and Hindi, all these Indian languages.
Yeah.
And so even though language is inherited, it's not in our DNA.
Right.
So in that way, it's epigenetic inheritance.
Okay.
That's all it is. That's all epigenetics means. It means anything that is inherited.
Outside of your genome.
But you can see it's very, very broad.
Right.
Going all the way to things that are cultural, like language, back to things that are physical, things connected to actual things in your genome. And my language, like English or Spanish or Hindi or Tamil, doesn't actually have that sort of physical embodiment in my DNA, even though other things do. So there can be a pretty big equivocation. If you think that that big, gigantic catch-all is some cohesive category, there's going to be some problems.
Okay. So I think where you know, as I'm talking with people in kind of the functional and integrative health realm, right, they're using epigenetic as a term to say, epi meaning kind of more environmental or outer factors, right, and then genetic. How are we, by our environment, the way that we live, the things that we eat, things that we do, etc., stuff we're exposed to, affecting our genetic expression of various different diseases. Have you heard epigenetic applied in that?
Yeah, absolutely.
How accurate is that?
Well, certainly. So, if you do certain things, it can actually affect your genome.
Sure.
So, for example, if you're smoking all the time, now there's going to be interaction, is the right way to think about it, with your genome. In several ways. So, for example, if you have specific mutations, you might actually be protected from cancer when you smoke. If you have other mutations, you might actually be much more susceptible to cancer or fibrosis or other sorts of health problems if you smoke.
Right.
Most likely, though, you're going to be kind of in this middle range where you're not particularly susceptible or particularly protected, but in that middle range where, the averages are about applicable to you. But when you smoke, it's actually carcinogenic. It actually causes mutations in your lungs, too. So then, what you're doing physically, that choice you're making to smoke, is actually affecting your actual genome. So all of those interactions are there at the same time. And in fact, some people might be more prone to picking up an addictive behavior like that too. So there's those interactions. And obviously, if your parents smoke, maybe it's not obvious, if your parents smoke, you're more likely to smoke too. So yeah, all of that stuff is interacting, but at the same time, smoking itself is not actually a genetic
right
thing. It's just behavior. And so you could think about almost everything fitting in society, fitting like that. So, dietary things, once again, are very much that way too. If your parents are vegetarian, it's much more likely you'll be vegetarian. And there's going to be all those sorts of interactions that we just talked about.
That would happen there. Yeah, so, okay. So, I've been really into, I've gotten all my raw DNA data, right, well, as much as I can. It varies by service what you can get, right, and then uploaded it into Prometheus, and then started looking into SNPs on Snipedia, and done all this fun, awesomely nerdy, science stuff that I'm trying to understand. Is there power in knowing what's in our DNA? There are a lot of people that are afraid of that.
Well, I don't think there's anything to be afraid of.
Okay.
Well,
privacy issues, things like that.
Okay, I should back that up. There are probably things to be afraid of, but that's a larger question. What I will say is, for the things to be afraid of, there's a lot of people who are really trying to make sure this is something that isn't abused. Now, are they going to be successful or not? Now, that could be an entire show we talk about.
And maybe we will, yes. Yeah.
So when it comes to what you're talking about, though, is where outside the medical profession, you've gotten what your some of the variation is in your genome, and you've uploaded it to a site, and you're looking to see how things are correlated with stuff, right?
Yeah.
So we should talk about what you can actually really figure out about yourself. So they're going to be
Let's go there. Yeah. Yeah.
So it turns out that the vast majority of the associations we get are what we would call low magnitude of effect.
Okay.
Which means that they don't actually have any very strong predictive ability. You were mentioning earlier that maybe some variation means that you might be better at math than other things.
Right. Yeah, and it did say it was some probability, right, based on research. There seems to be some probability that this particular SNP might affect your math ability.
Yeah, so what's going on there...
Actually, it wasn't a SNP, it was just a piece of DNA. It wasn't a single nucleotide polymorphism, if I said that right.
Yeah.
Pat on the back for me.
A SNP is a single nucleotide polymorphism. Yeah, so I think there's a lot going on here. I'm trying to think about the right way to say this concisely. I just say that this should be taken with not just a grain of salt, with a major spoonful of salt.
Okay, fair enough.
Where it's closer probably to astrology than to actually science, the extent to which we should trust them.
So disappointing. It was so fun to read. And now this is not...
Well, astrology can be fun to read too, right?
Right?
But you don't want to think it defines your life.
Well, yeah, but it did, and I mentioned that to you too. It was fun because I started looking at this list of potential characteristics that might be related to things that are in your DNA, right? And it was your ability for math, how quickly you anger, things like that. And I thought, well, how interesting if, and I don't know what everyone else's belief is listening. Personally, I'm a Christian, and I was thinking about, God and picking out the parents that I had and the body I was going to have and the DNA I was going to have and the experience that I was going to have based on that. And it was kind of a magical thing to let my mind wander down that path. But now maybe it's a little less so.
Well, you're kind of into the idea, does God put you into a particular body? I mean, sure, that could be true. But the question, though, is how defined are your possibilities by, your genetics?
By your genetics versus your environment and all those other factors that that epi part of that.
Yeah, so it turns out that, most of the differences that you get from DNA are skin deep. Now, there are exceptions, all right? There are exceptions, but most of the differences are skin deep. It turns out that, of course, the color of your hair, the color of your, well, except for unless you dye your hair.
Sure, fair enough.
So there, even then
we can affect it, yeah.
Yeah, the color of your eyes, unless you're wearing contacts. I mean, the color of your skin, unless you get tanned. I mean, you see how we're starting to have problems already?
Yeah.
So yeah, all of these things are influenced by genetics, but not usually in some profoundly definitive way. And I think the part where we really want to be cautious is when it comes to the ways we think. It turns out almost everything about the way we think is defined much more strongly by the way we were raised and by our culture than by anything in our genetics. Now, of course, there's going to be influences from genetics, but in general, they tend to be a much weaker influence than we think.
Interesting. Which is funny that you just said, influenced by your family and your culture. And that's actually the original conversation we had that made me want you to come on the show, which, again, everyone just stay tuned. We're going to have more conversations in the future. I'm very excited to have you back in this or another incarnation at some point. Thank you for being here today, Dr. Swamidass.
Seems like we started a whole bunch of rabbit trails that we'll have to follow up on at some time.
There's nothing better than a good rabbit hole to fall down, in my opinion. So, anything that you want to share? Any last thoughts?
No, I think we're in an amazing time where I think what's really exciting about these conversations about genetics and epigenetics and personalized this and that is that it's bringing us back to some of the grand questions of what it really means to be human. What is it that binds us together? What is it that makes us different? And so it's not something to get put off by. It's something actually to really enter deeper into as we consider together that grand question, what does it mean to be human?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've been glad to be human sitting across from you having this conversation, so thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So that was Dr. Joshua Swamidass, Associate Professor of Laboratory and Genomic Medicine at Washington University. I am Amanda LaPlante. You've been listening to Get Real to Heal on KWRH-LP 92.9 FM. If you have any questions or would like to contact me about health coaching, please reach out at 314-583-6749. You can also find me online at amandalaplante.com. You can listen to this and other episodes of Get Real to Heal at soundcloud.com/GetRealToHeal, and keep in touch on Facebook.com/GetRealToHeal as well. Make it a great day. Fun.
Cool.
Thank you so much.
Oh, my pleasure. That was fun.
It was a great time. Yeah. Did we have any questions on there that?
No, I think I put it up too quickly. So let's see
Gotcha.
here. So nothing there. So cool.
All right, fair enough. I saw some
That's
things
okay. It was
going up
pretty
over
quick.
here. Yeah, it was fun. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.